Hello, Biology 1620. Welcome to a new and exciting chapter in our course. Um, I have never done something like this before, so please bear with me. And in general, let's all be patient and kind and helpful to each other. We're all in this together, and we'll all help each other get through it. We will try our very best to be accommodating to everyone as best we can, and we're all just kind of making this up as we go along, so let's figure it out together. All right, let's jump right into the topic for today, which is biomes and global ecology. So biome is a broad geographic area with similar sets of communities, and a big theme of today's topic is that biomes in different parts of the world have strong similarities to each other. So that's why we call them biomes. So for example, a desert in North America and a desert in Asia are going to have strong similarities, which is why we call a desert a thing. A deciduous forest in North America and a deciduous forest in Europe have a lot of similarities. And so let's think about why that is. You may not have thought very much before, because we kind of take it for granted that the equators of Earth are a lot hotter and sunnier than the northern or southern parts of the Earth. And the reason why this is because the Earth is round. It's a ball. And the sun is shining light at the level of the equator of the Earth. So the equator of the Earth and the equator of the sun are pretty much lined up. And so light from the sun hits the Earth full on, straight on at the equator at a flat angle. So all of those sun rays hit the surface of the Earth at about the same perpendicular 90-degree angle. And as you go north or south, here we're just showing north, the angle changes such that each square meter or square foot or whatever of the land receives actually fewer photons of light. Less sunlight is hitting each patch of land on the Earth. So the further north you get, you actually are receiving less sunlight per surface area. And that's entirely because the Earth is round. And this has huge consequences. It's warmer on the equators. And that is a big reason why we see the biomes where we see them. But before we get back to the biomes again, a little bit more about the basic physics of the Earth and seasons. For example, the reason why we have seasons is also not obvious. So it's common to see the Earth's orbit around the sun drawn in a highly elliptical orbit, such that it looks like the sun is much closer to us in some parts of the year than others. And that is true, but it's grossly exaggerated usually when you see this, because the Earth's orbit around the sun is actually almost entirely circular, such that we actually are only very, very slightly closer to the sun during some parts of the year than others. And that very, very minor difference in distance to the sun during the year is actually not the reason why we have seasons. That difference is way too minor to make much of a difference in the seasons. The reasons why we have different seasons during the year is actually because the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees off of being perfectly straight. And so in the northern summer, the northern part of the Earth is actually tilted towards the sun so that the sun rays are hitting the northern hemisphere at a flatter angle, on a more full-on angle than in the southern hemisphere. And then in northern winter and southern summer, the southern hemisphere is getting more of a direct angle from the sun, and the northern hemisphere is more pointed away from the sun. And that's actually the reason for the seasons, not because of distance to the sun. So again, it's because the Earth is round, and then in this case, the seasons are because of the Earth's tilt. So a fun fact is that the reason why the Earth is tilted is actually because of the huge impact that formed the moon. So a long time ago, when the Earth was very, very young, it didn't have a moon, or it had a small moon, or maybe it had a ring, actually. And then some kind of huge object slammed into the Earth, fused with the Earth, and the detritus, the leftovers from that giant impact event, is what became the moon. And the Earth's tilt is actually a leftover side effect from that gigantic impact that formed the moon. So that's just a little fun fact. Let's get back to how this affects climate and then how that affects biology. Because you get more sunlight hitting the Earth at the equator, then you get heat, more heat at the equator, and heat rises. So you have air rising at the equator. The air doesn't just go out into space, it has to go somewhere, so it has to move either north or south. Then as it gets colder, it drops again, and that creates the circulation current of hot air rising, moving, cooling down, and then dropping again. And if the Earth were not rotating, if the Earth did not spin, you might expect a circulation pattern like this. But because the Earth does spin, it's wonderfully complicated, and you can take whole classes or even spend your entire career trying to study how the Earth's air and water moves because of the fact that the Earth spins. And this is what causes weather and climate. And so because the Earth is spinning, you don't just get huge circulation cells like this. Instead you get smaller circulation cells that are distributed around the world like this, and they get funny names like this, which you don't have to know. You just have to know that warm air rises, that causes rain. As the warm air cools down, the air then moves, which causes the circulation pattern. As the air cools down, it drops again, and that forms a circulation cell. A little bit more detail on how this affects biology. As I just said, we zoom into the equator and what is called a Hadley cell, which is the type of circulation pattern you get near the equator and between the tropics, at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. This is why you get lots of rain in equatorial rainforests, for example, is because the rain drops as the hot air rises and cools down. And then you get deserts near about 30 degrees north and south because you get this descending warming air that has lost all of its rain, so it's super dry. Because it's dry, then it absorbs any moisture that it meets when it comes down to the surface, so it makes the land even drier, as well as not even dropping any rain, moves along that land, warming up until it reaches the equator, at which point it rises again, drops the moisture that it has absorbed, and the cycle continues. So that's why you get warm, wet climates near the equator and dry, desert-like environments near about 30 degrees north and south. And so that fact that you get wet climates near the equator and dry climates at 30 degrees north and south is a consequence of the fact of the angle that sunlight hits the Earth and the fact that the Earth is rotating. Another thing that I want to point out is that the sunlight and the rotation of the Earth and the tilt of the Earth affect how air moves around the Earth, and it also affects how water moves around the Earth. So that is ocean currents. And ocean currents also have a big effect on climate. One of the most famous examples is the Gulf Stream current that takes warm, roughly equatorial water from around the Caribbean, and it transports that warm water along the east coast of the United States, which is why you get warm beaches on the east coast, and even though beaches on the west coast at the same latitude are actually quite cold. So if you've gone swimming off the coast of California, the water is actually quite cold, and you can have pretty warm beaches off the coast of New Jersey, even though it's usually the weather in New Jersey is not as nice as the weather on land in California. And that's because of the Gulf Stream current. It's transporting really warm water north along the east coast and all the way up into the Arctic even. And it's a little bit subtle on this figure, but it actually warms northern Europe quite a bit because it is transporting heat from the equator north up here. One note, in case anybody's wondering, this graph that I'm showing is not a temperature graph. So it is not that the water at the equator is cold. This is actually a heat flux graph. So it's actually measuring the amount of heat that is moving from the ocean into the atmosphere. So at the equator, the atmosphere is actually warming the ocean. So heat is flowing from the atmosphere into the ocean, which is why this is blue. And in the Gulf Stream current, the heat is actually moving from the ocean into the back out of the ocean into the atmosphere, which is why it's showing red. So if you didn't really care about that, no worries, just anticipating that question. So this graph is accentuating the degree to which these ocean currents are transporting heat and also moving heat from the ocean out back into the atmosphere. Okay, that's another example of how climate is affected by the movement of air and water. And so going back to this graph that I showed at the very beginning of our biomes, you can notice on this graph of biomes on Earth that you get similar biomes at similar latitudes. So in this reddish color, you get deserts around 30 degrees north. In Africa, Saudi Arabia, Middle East, Mexico. We'll talk about the northern deserts later in this lecture. You also get deserts at 30 degrees south, especially in Australia and Southern Africa, not so much in South America, which is an exception that proves the rule that we can talk about later. And then at the equator is where you get really wet rainforests in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. And then you get deciduous forests, and actually the yellow is showing grasslands. You get grasslands in the middle of North America and in Asia. You get boreal forests, or coniferous forests. That is lots of gymnosperms in the far north, like in Canada, Alaska, and also in northern Asia. And so there's a latitudinal pattern to where you find biomes. So just to show you some pretty pictures of the things that I just showed you. So this is a picture of a tropical rainforest. You find these at the equator because the equator is where you get wet, hot climates. Wet because the air is rising, cooling down, and dropping its water. You get deserts at around 30 degrees north and south because that's where the air descends and the air is dry. And then you get deciduous forests around 45 degrees north and 45 degrees south because that's where you get a secondary circulation current with a little bit wetter and more moderate air. And then as you go further north, then you get wet and cold climates where rain is dropping, but because it's so far north, it's cold. And this is where you get boreal forests. Boreal just means north. Basically means lots of evergreen forests. And this is all intuitive, right? I think we all kind of had a general idea of this, but maybe didn't think about it in these very precise terms before. And we can get a little bit more precise by defining biomes by precipitation, which is shown here on the y-axis, and temperature on the x-axis. And we just said that biomes have a latitudinal pattern, and that pattern is caused because different latitudes tend to have different precipitation and different temperature. So the latitudinal pattern is caused by biomes being defined by the amount of precipitation they have and the amount of temperature. So a tundra is very cold and has very little precipitation. A rainforest is very warm and has lots of precipitation. A desert is very warm with no precipitation, and you have all these things in the middle as well. Okay, I think so far so good, right? So let's talk about how this affects biology, and spell this out in a little bit more detail. So here, once again, we have a tropical rainforest at the equator in Brazil. If you make this drier and colder. I just saw that this text was running off the edge. Sorry about that. This would be this is a temperate forest in Utah, actually. So if you just go north from Brazil to 45 degrees latitude, then a tropical rainforest. If you take that tropical rainforest and go north to Utah, then it becomes drier and colder. So now it's a temperate forest instead of a tropical rainforest. And you get a very similar forest in Germany, which is at a similar latitude to Utah. we also get temperate rainforest there. So difference in latitude means a difference in precipitation temperature. We're just spelling that out again. I'm just reinforcing this concept. So here's yet another example. If you have a tundra very far north, 60 degrees latitude, and then you make that warmer by going south, then now you have a grassland. You make it even warmer by going further south, and you have a desert. Okay, I think that should be fairly self-explanatory. So let's think about how this affects our lives, or how it will affect our lives soon. So by the year 2100, there are many different scenarios of how global warming will progress. If current trends continue, the world could be as much as 6 degrees Celsius warmer by the year 2100. And if we make huge political and economic changes, which are not yet begun, then we could possibly limit the warming to about 2 degrees Celsius. There are some extremely optimistic efforts out there to try to limit to 1.5 degrees. So let's think about how these different scenarios would affect tundra. So if the Earth becomes 6 degrees warmer, what would happen to a tundra? And if the Earth only becomes 2 degrees warmer, what would happen to a tundra? And then think about that same thing for grasslands. If the Earth becomes 6 degrees warmer, what happens to the grasslands? And if it becomes 2 degrees warmer, what happens to the grasslands? So if we were all meeting in person, this would be a group activity. You would talk to each other. And as I am recording this, we're not sure exactly how we're going to do group activities. I think we might still try to do them online somehow. So stay tuned, check the Canvas announcements in your emails for how we would like you to report the results of this activity. Okay. So that ends part 1. Part 2 is going to begin in a separate recording that will be posted separately online. So, part 2,